right. And we are back with a very niche grief topic today. How are
Mhm.
you, Liz?
I'm doing well. How are
How's
you?
how's that baby cooking?
We are
We have a baby
fully cooked.
coming soon, guys. The
We're
house is
fully
on
cooked. Yeah,
its wedding.
it's fully cooked.
It's fully cooked any day now. So
Yes, you can join us on the outside any day now.
we'll have to show him on an episode.
Yeah,
I'll have to
he'll
bring him
join
in.
us. Yeah,
He's actually been in a lot of episodes, but just people haven't seen him,
we
you
didn't
know.
even know. Yeah.
um, all right. So I Oh, man, I think this really goes back to, the day I called you, wanted to do this podcast, and did not wanna back myself into the
Mm,
life after loss grief hole, and I said, "It's too narrow of a topic, I don't think it'll help enough people," all these things,
right.
and have already realized that was so not true, but even bigger than that is I always thought to even kind of, take that funnel down a little bit more,
Mm,
suicide specifically, there's
yeah.
just not a lot of people that have experienced it. Okay, I was so wrong. I was so wrong. And I've posted that and said that before, but just the amount of people that I feel like once I opened up and said I've lost someone to suicide, that you find out have lost someone to suicide is just,
Mhm,
at least to me, and maybe not in your field, but to me, it was like
mhm.
you probably see the reality of that more than I ever would just in a normal day to day.
But I think we can't ever compare what I've experienced in my clinical world with the
Sure.
lived human
I
experience.
just
So, like, I
maybe
chose.
on a percentage rate of how
Yeah.
often this happens. Where I guess why would I even randomly research that? Like
Yeah.
how often does suicide happen? Um,
Right.
but so I know that this episode may not relate as much to all of our followers, but I'm hoping that it'll truly relate to people that have lost someone to suicide specifically,
Yeah.
or benefit people who love somebody who's lost somebody to suicide and they're trying to navigate that friendship, that relationship, that whatever that looks like. Because as much as I do think it's a different kind of loss, and I don't know how to describe it.
Mm,
But for me, I've mentioned this before in this set. I had a friend who asked me, we have very open, some would call morbid, but just very open conversations about very traumatic things. And one of the first things she said to me, this had to be within a month, was sorry, let me back up. I'm word vomiting right now. For those of you listening that are newer, I lost my dad to murder when I was 9. He was a police officer killed in line of duty. And then I lost my little brother in 2020, who was 17 at the time, to suicide.
mhm.
They are such completely different losses at completely different stages in my life, different ages, because had they happened in the reverse order, maybe I'd feel differently. So all I can speak to is me, and I hope nobody takes anything I'm saying as fact. I just want to share my thoughts on it so that it can maybe help somebody else, whether that
Mm,
again is somebody who's experienced it or somebody who is trying to love somebody through that loss.
yeah.
Um, and she asked me, is it worse to lose somebody to murder, to suicide?
Mm,
And I was just like, "Oh, that's such a good question." Actually, my first answer was, "I don't know, what do you think?" And she said, "Well, you're the only one that's experienced both, so maybe you should answer it." And I was like, "Oh my god, I have." In
mm,
that moment, I was so deep on the loss of William that I was like, "Oh shit, I have lost somebody to murder and to suicide. That's wild. Why does that exist?
yeah.
Literally, why does that exist?" And then something that I thought was crazy is I put this post on Instagram one day that said, on the House of Halls Instagram, and it was basically, how have you lost somebody, or what have you lost somebody to, or I've lost somebody to, and it was a blank, and so people commented, and there was two other people on there that said they lost somebody to murder and to suicide. I was like,
Mhm,
really?
mhm.
Didn't think we existed in
Yeah.
numbers.
Right, like, I don't want this to be a club.
Yeah, and I think at one point I might have even said, and maybe I just go back and forth on this, but I may have said one wasn't worse than the other, they're just different. But and maybe I feel this way because the other one I was older and it's more recent to me, but I actually think I've changed my stance
Okay.
and that losing someone to suicide was worse. And I say that because I think if it had been murder or it had been a car accident or it had been a number of other things, I could have maybe justified the loss or blamed somebody
Mhm.
else or just like all of these ways that you try to process it in your brain afterward and heal and cope, like, it was just, like, grasping and nothing was there because you couldn't grab anything because it was just like, it is nobody's fault, it wasn't
There's
an
no
accident,
logic.
wasn't yeah, like, it was just this, like, more of trying to heal from it was like, I'm just at a loss of, like,
Mm,
I don't know where to go with
mhm.
this feeling, with this anger, with this any of it, like, who do I can't direct the anger at William. I'm like, I'm not mad at I miss you so much that I can't even be mad at you no matter
Yeah,
what, like,
yeah,
but I am mad, so, like, where does that anger go, you
yeah,
know? And there isn't anybody to blame, and it's all these things, and then you sit there and stir on, like, could it have been prevented? Could it was it social media influence? Was it other people in his life influence? Was it just a deep hole of depression? Was it a combination? And I think what's so hard is like we'll never know.
mhm,
Like we'll never know. And I don't know if it feels different for somebody who maybe had like a letter that explained it in detail or like we didn't have that. He
right,
left a note, it said goodbye and had a smiley face. Like there was nothing. And so I think it's just
mm,
it's so hard to process just like you can't make sense of it maybe is the
mm,
not that I can make sense of a murder, but like I can give facts, I can give a situation, I can give,
mhm,
this is what happened, this is why this guy did this is how it all went down, and
and they
this
can
just
be punished if
me
they're still alive, like, there could be some element of justice.
yeah, and it's funny that you say that because I also remember, like, I've been asked that or, like, and heard that so many times through my dad's case, and I remember when they did, like, the final sentencing, and I walked out of the courthouse, and the news people were there, and they're like, "Do you feel like justice was served?" And I'm like, "What is justice?" Like,
Right, he's not
my
coming
dad's still
back.
dead, like, yeah, the guy's in jail, cool, that doesn't change my life, like, it's so, like, that's such a hard thing, but I think
Yeah,
to your point, yeah, there is some sense of, like, if you have all these chapters, right, you can close some of them.
mm,
With suicide, it's like, how do I close any of them? Like,
mhm,
I have no answers. I just have to be like, "Okay, it happened, and I have to accept it, and I have to carry on." And I think that is what makes it so much harder.
mhm,
I do. Like, I don't know, and not that I would downplay a death in any other scenario, but, like,
of
I
course,
think the processing of suicide feels much harder for me than the processing of other losses I've experienced.
mhm. Yeah, and I'll just share for any of our new listeners, I am a psychiatric nurse practitioner, and so my clinical practice is with children and families, across the lifespan, but with a variety of mental health topics and clinical issues when appropriate. And so, one of the things when Jen came to me with this concept of how do we normalize hard conversations? How do we support people who are living with suicidal thoughts and or grieving the loss of someone to suicide? How do we build community around that? Because it didn't really exist. And I think what you shared with me initially was the more you opened up, the more people came to you and said, "Me too." Or, "Wait,
Mhm.
can you say more about that? How did you find that out?" Or, "How did you start to heal?" And that's kind of how this all came to be because as much as there are unique elements to your story, there are also generalizable principles and skills that we can talk about. And I think you're very clear. There's no comparison. Like, you're not saying grief is scalable or this or that, but you are saying there are nuances and
Mhm.
it's not the same. And so we wouldn't minimize anyone's experience of loss or grief. But there are definitely elements of losing someone to suicide that are very hard to articulate and continue to live with because we like answers. Like, our brain wants closure,
Mhm.
our emotions want an outlet, That's how we process. And so when we find ourselves in a life circumstance, that's not an option. Like there's not a clear answer and there's not a clear outlet, and we can't get our person back that we love. It sucks. And, I think one of the things you described really well is radical acceptance, which is kind of a therapy term where we say, we're going to accept this. It doesn't mean we're going to know what to do in every single moment, but
Mhm.
we're going to accept this to be our new reality. And then we're going to deal with what comes.
The repercussions.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
they're going to look different for every single person. But I think when we live in the questioning of, well, what about this? What about that? Could I have done something? We're exhausting our internal resources and our ability to heal.
Mm.
Everyone's process is going to be different. That is a healthy thing to explore if that's what comes up for you, if that's where you currently are as an individual listening to this. Those things aren't wrong. But it's also to be mindful at some point we do have to accept that a person that we loved is no longer living. And then we have to choose how we want to move forward. What meaning do we want to give that in our life?
Mhm.
And that process is incredibly personal and painful
Yeah.
to each person who's navigating it. What are your thoughts about that?
I 100% agree, and if I will share how I guess I've gotten through that,
Mm,
for anyone that may find these thoughts helpful, because there's kind of 2 things that I truly go to when I
yeah.
do kind of, like, backtrack and go down that road. I
Mhm.
will also preface it with I have done a lot of therapy. A lot of therapy. I didn't, like, go to sleep one night and wake up with this, on my own. Um, but I also, in saying that, wanna say that the therapy was much more frequent early
Mhm.
on, and now it's very, like, as needed. Like, if I feel like I'm in a tough season, and usually it's not even specifically William that I will struggle with, but I feel like if I, just even a couple of weeks ago, I had posted something on Instagram, like, I was just having a hard time. Like, I have a lot of friends going through a lot of hard things right now, just hard life things,
Mhm.
and it just kinda seemed to trickle, and it was just one after another, and I love to be that person that they're calling and that I'm there for them, but, like, it kinda weighs heavy on you, right? And then we're also going into this season where I think I miss William a little more than most, and it was just
Yeah.
overwhelmingly emotional for me. And I think in those times when I'm in, like, I don't wanna say, like, a sadder state of mind, but, like, a heavier season,
Yeah.
I do start to think back to, like, I don't know, I get more in the weeds of losing
Mhm.
him. And so the 2 things I kinda go to, one is I don't even know where I heard this, but, um, someone told me at some point that what if is the devil's playground. And I
Mhm.
wanna say it was actually our pastor that when we were in the hospital room, I think he said it to my mom. I could have made that
Mhm.
situation up, but somebody said to me or to around me, and it very, like, resonated, was the what ifs are the devil's playground. And I was
Right.
just like, oh my god, yeah. Yes, like, that there is no healing that is gonna come from a what if, right? Like,
Mhm.
what if we had stopped him? What if we okay, like, let's go down that path, right? And I think I went through a phase where I did need to visit the what ifs. There were a
Yeah.
few what ifs where I was like, "All right, how would the what if? What
Right.
if, Matthew found him sooner and he hadn't done it yet?
Mhm.
Okay, well, then what does his life look like? Are we then worried about him 24/7 that it is gonna happen? Is he in a mental institution? Is that really what he wanted his like, there's just the what ifs just lead to more what ifs, and it doesn't I don't know any scenario where the what ifs were gonna give me closure. Like, they were not beneficial. And again, I did have a season where I had to explore some of them and think through some of them and come to that conclusion.
Yeah.
And the other thing for me was knowing the reason wouldn't change the outcome. So
Mhm.
anytime that I'm like, was it social? Was it what he was listening to?
Mhm.
Blah.
Mm.
Now, aside from like, and I don't think there's any world that I can make a change in that world of like, hey, we can't put these songs out that talk about suicide and we can't do trends on social media. Like I don't have the power to stop those things, right? So like all I can do is accept the fact that whatever it was that I will never know, like
Right.
regardless, is even if I knew the exact reason, is the outcome the same? And the answer is yes, he's still gone.
Mhm.
So like, does it really matter? And I think some people may feel differently about that, but like to
Right.
me, I go to those 2 things. Does knowing more change the outcome? The answer is no. And then what ifs are the devil's playground. And I just kind of stop my thoughts there of like,
Yeah.
this is not productive. This does not benefit me in any way. This isn't going to bring me any sort of peace, closure, happiness. Like I have to steer my thoughts in a different direction because this is
Yeah.
just going down a hole that I won't be able to climb out of.
Mm, yeah. And I think that's where there are some thoughts for people they need to process for themselves to come to that conclusion, like, "This is not productive for me."
Yep.
And I don't think we always know that when we're living in complex grief
Mhm.
or and I say complex grief because I do think a loss to suicide can lead to complex grief because you don't have a lot of the same, um, experiences as other grief scenarios. So, and what I mean by other grief scenarios, there are natural things in life like losing someone to death of old age where we've got time and or they were older and or they were sick, right? There's elements of other grief that is still sad and we could still have similar what ifs.
To more
And
prepare your mind for,
yes, we have a place in our brain for that. We
essentially.
don't have a place in our brain for this idea of someone taking their own life. So it is very bombarding to someone's psyche to try and rationalize an irrational thought.
Mhm.
And the reason I use that language is because that's what suicidal thoughts are. They're a treatable symptom of depression. And so anytime we talk about suicide or suicidal thoughts, I think it's really important to be mindful that there is an element of a medical illness present. If you are living with suicidal thoughts, that is like living with a fever. You have an element of suffering that is causing your brain to produce an irrational thought. If I end my life, I will feel better. And that is where, whenever we think of someone who has taken their own life, to approach them with compassion. Because if there's anything I know to be true, it's that there was an element of suffering. And I don't say that to project suffering on people. I just say that because I do not think anyone in their rational thinking mind that feels connected to themselves in meaningful ways and to others has those thoughts,
Mhm.
right?
Yep.
And so when our brain gets put in a position of prolonged stress, prolonged isolation, you know, um, different other symptoms that can lead to suicidal thoughts, we should approach that with compassion. And there's a lot of ways that we will never fully understand.
Yeah.
And so, I'm privileged to sit in a seat where people do share some of those dark thoughts with me and or those scary moments or feelings. And that helps me understand for individuals who choose not to act on them or act on them and fail, right? How we can kind of rework those. Um, and so I think when you are left living and you've lost someone and you've never encountered this stuff before, it's completely jarring.
Yeah. I think it's a good word. Yeah, you just feel like helpless,
Mhm.
and which I'd imagine you'd feel in any loss, but it's just like this. I do. I think you immediately go to like, this was preventable.
Mm.
I think that was like the hardest pill to swallow. Was
Mm.
like, ugh, it was preventable. But then I also go back to that just gets me down the what if trail. Like that
Right,
it's
and
it's not
and
preventable if you didn't know it was there.
it's not preventable if you didn't know it was there, and I think that's the other piece that I try to be sensitive to always is just because I know suicidal thoughts are a treatable symptom of depression, that doesn't mean all individuals have access to care or
Mhm.
that all individuals know about free resources, like
Yeah,
the crisis text line, which
yeah.
is 741-741. If it's not programmed in your phone, I strongly encourage you to. You're immediately connected with a crisis counselor 24/7. And I think because the social stigma around mental health, mental illness, suicidal thoughts is pretty polarizing. If
Mhm.
you are an individual who doesn't feel like you can say these things out loud to others, you internalize them.
Mhm.
And that's not a shame or a blame. It's just saying that is how some people are moving through the world. And so we don't know. We genuinely don't know that they're not okay.
Yeah, that's hard.
And that's hard. And I think that's part of where you're someone who purposes your grief in a way where you're like, wait, other people have experienced this. We're going to create a place to talk about it.
Yeah.
Because if more people feel seen in their grief, then maybe more people would be willing to talk about their feelings,
Mhm.
period.
Yeah. You know, I was thinking the other week, I'm like, I feel like it's actually more of a double-edged sword than I thought because
Mm,
I felt that way, like, there's a lot of people that don't have a place to talk about those things,
yeah.
but I also feel like there's a strong part of me that constantly thinks on, like, suicide. Like, it has
Yeah.
truly changed the way I even treat people, right? Because I approach friendships, relationships, strength, like, all these things with, like, I don't know, and 2 weeks ago when I had a lot of friends, I mean, they're still going through it, but it was the initial, like, just everybody at once, like, "Hey, I'm struggling with this, I'm going through this, I'm having a sad day," and I used to struggle with people reaching out to me with that because I felt like I'm very type 1, type A, I'm like, "Oh, I have to fix that," and I'm like, "That's not my they just need me to listen." Like, they feel safe coming to me, and, like, that's who I can be for them.
Mhm.
But I also look at it as like, man, we have all these mutual friends and all these other people in your life that just have no idea what's going on right now. And
Mm,
it just gives me this perspective of like, it is like, I feel like it's so cliche to say, like, you never know what someone's going through. Just be kind, just be kind, just be
you
kind. But
don't.
I truly think, like, hey, how I treat someone, like, what if I bump into somebody when I'm opening the door at Starbucks, because we all know I frequent there, and they make me spill my coffee, right? In that moment, I can control one thing, and it's how I react.
Mhm.
And if I lose my shit and I'm pissed off and yelling at this person and whatever, however I choose to react, like, what if that was like, I don't know, they stopped in the bathroom and they were going to end their life, right?
Mhm.
And then that's the last interaction they have. Or what if they're
Mm,
like, oh, I'm so sorry. I'm like, you know what? It's totally okay. I have 85 more outfits. Like, this is going to be fine. And, like, please don't feel bad about this. Like, I hope your day, this isn't like a, s- a foreshadow of how your day is going to go. Like, I hate spilling coffee, whatever it is. Like, I can treat them with, like, as a human, right? And just be like,
mm,
people make mistakes. Like, it happens. And somebody showing them compassion in that moment can
mm.
change their life. They
Yes.
might be like, oh my God, that's not how I expected that person to react in that moment,
Mhm.
right? And maybe it's not as drastic as they were going to end their life, but maybe somebody was just having a really hard time that it could be going down that road, or they're very depressed, or it happens sometimes, and then they have that experience. But what if more people acted like that and they start having all these experiences of just compassion and
Yeah.
feeling accepted and not like they're a screw up or however and it's just like
Mhm.
I started thinking about it. I'm like, that's what I wanted House of Halls to be. Like,
Mm,
yes, if you're feeling that crappy, and I feel like grief can just compound those feelings, like, I can't imagine
mhm.
already being depressed or already being in a hard place and then experiencing a traumatic loss. Like, where do you go from there, you
Yeah.
know? But I think it's so important to have somewhere you can go, somebody you can talk to. Yes, the crisis hotline, I think, is just an amazing thing, and you don't have to feel vulnerable or scared because nobody's ever gonna know you reached out,
Yeah.
and it's just a safe place to get some help until maybe
Yes.
you're ready to talk to somebody else about it or let somebody you love know.
Mhm.
Um, and I think it's a very brave thing for somebody to say, like, "Hey, I have a friend of mine who she'll just randomly text me and say, like, I'm having a hard day and I needed someone to know." And I love that I'm that for her. And there's a lot of
That's a
times, like,
great text.
yeah, I would
That's a
say,
great
like, I would
text.
say half the time they don't actually end up giving me details. Like,
Yeah.
by the time we can talk and I'm like, "What's going on?" Sometimes that season's already passed. And like, "I'm okay now, but I needed to not be alone in that." And I'm just like,
Yeah.
"Good." Like, I'm so glad I was who you could come to, and I'm even more glad that you knew
Mm,
that you needed somebody to know,
mhm.
if that makes sense. So,
Yes, having insight to say, "Today's really hard for me. Just I need you to know. Like,
yeah.
check on me later." Um, as you're talking, I'm thinking feelings aren't facts,
Mm,
and that is really hard because when you're thinking about just an interaction we've all had, like bumping into someone in public, and that makes you feel something like
Right.
probably frustration, probably annoyance. I don't know. My initial reaction is not like, ha ha ha, have a good day. It's like,
Yeah.
"Wait, what just happened?" And
Yeah.
so I think the more that we practice reflecting on a feeling and then a choice instead of a response, like, I want to choose to be compassionate to you in this moment. I want to choose to be kind. I want to choose not to take out my feelings on you.
Mm,
The more that we practice that, the easier it is to just observe our feelings versus conclude with them. Because that in grief is tough. That is so hard. And so if you aren't practicing that in other ways, it's really hard not to be clouded by feelings when you're grieving. And we don't get to choose our feelings. That's like one of the weirdest things about being human. People, my brain always goes here because I work primarily in pediatrics, but people a lot of times will say to their children, like, you're fine, get
mhm.
over it. It's like, we cannot do that. That is literally humanly impossible to just
Mhm.
like muster the will to be fine.
Yeah.
We have to allow the feeling to process. We can choose our thoughts. We can choose something like, I am safe or I will be okay, right? And so I think the more we find avenues in our life to practice that, the easier it is to do in these harder,
Yes.
more emotionally gray areas.
Mhm. Yeah, I agree. I think I I almost hate, like, when you're saying that, they're, "Oh, you need to choose to be happy. You need to choose happiness. You need to."
No.
I think maybe choose your all you can choose is your reaction. And I tell my kids that all the time. What can you control right now? How you react to this situation. And even if your feelings are a certain way, doesn't mean you need to react or act in that manner, right? Like,
Mhm.
being frustrated doesn't mean you need to act. Now, granted, I know they're kids and they only have so much control, but I just think it's such an important lesson.
Yeah.
And maybe I'm wrong and I'll screw them up, but there's worse things. But I always look at it as like, okay, in this moment, what could you control? How you reacted, right? And I know it takes a lot of practice and I'm not perfect. I also like will lose my ish and then turn around and be like, I probably shouldn't have lost it in that moment. But we're human. But I think if we can intentionally practice it in moments that aren't as emotionally elevated,
Yes.
that it's like if we practice it, and I've talked about this in like being kind, being gratitude, worry, all of those things. Like I think everything, if you make a list of the kind of person you aim to be or the kind of
Mm.
interactions you choose to have, then you can kind of narrow that down to like, okay, well, how do I need to act in order to create this scenario, right? And
Mhm.
then we have to practice that in every facet. And it's things as little as like spilling water in the kitchen or your jacket getting, hooked on a door handle when you're already having a terrible day.
The
And
worst.
it works, but it only happens when you're already pissed off, right? Like
Yeah,
it
always.
never happens when you're like chill. It's like, I'm
No.
already in a rush. I'm already mad at everybody. Boom, the belt loop is in the door handle. And you're just like, now we're going to rip this door off the hinges. And but I think it is in your daily life, like, and it doesn't mean it's going to happen right away, but I think it's in practicing, like, and reflecting and saying, okay, in that moment, what could I have done differently? And the next time
Yeah.
you just make the effort. And it takes time. It does. But if you do it enough, it will become natural and it does become those bigger things
Mhm.
where you almost shock people by your lack of reaction or the reaction they didn't
Or you
expect.
surprise yourself.
I'm sorry.
You can surprise yourself.
Oh yeah,
Like,
like, wow, I didn't lose it.
yeah, like, I think that's kind
Let's
of the
still come
most
back.
that's kind of the most entertaining part for me when
Yeah.
people are like and I didn't yell at my kid, I just sat there and stared at them, and I'm like, "That's awesome." And they're like, "No, it was so confusing."
Like I don't know what's wrong
I
with me. I
didn't
thought
know
maybe
how
I
to
lost
talk
my
with
voice.
you. So, no,
I had a stroke, honestly.
I totally agree with you, and I think that's where I'm going with this is you can't change your response to how you're gonna feel about losing a loved one to suicide. You're gonna have your feelings,
Yeah.
and you get to choose the time that you visit them, hopefully, right? I think there's acute periods, but
There's
then
work
that's
that has
okay.
to be done to get to that
Yes,
stage, and
there's work
yeah,
that has to be done to get there. But
don't
yes,
wanna diminish that, but it is possible.
it is possible in time and with work. Um, Work that leads to relief, I think, and, um, helps you keep living.
Mhm.
I love that you said I don't know if it was in our conversation just now or another episode, but I feel like you use the word legacy a lot when you say like, yes, I want to like process how I feel, but I want to like honor his legacy. Like, and I think that can be helpful for people to think about. Like, well, what do I want this to mean?
Yeah. Yeah. I think and maybe that's a good way to think of it too, like, losing someone to suicide is you can almost choose to reflect them in how you move forward with your
Mhm.
life,
Mhm.
and that's not to say if somebody's still, like, in the deep, deep, deep sea of their grief that you're in the wrong or you're not, being the right person for who they want you to be, like, that's not what I'm saying, but I just mean, if that person loved you, you loved them, like, they didn't do it because they want you to be miserable the rest of your life. That I can assure you of. And so it's like, how can I go on living in a way that might make them proud or might honor
Mhm.
them? Or
Mhm.
like, do they want me to just wake up and cry every day? Do they,
Mhm.
and there's a point and I I have a very love-hate relationship with the whole time heals thing because I don't think heals is the right word, but I think what time does is give you it's as time passes, you've just had more time to process. You've had time to put in the work. You've had
Mhm.
time
Right.
to reach a space that isn't as emotionally charged to where you can get somewhere that feels a little more healing. And
Mm.
I think the reason I've always struggled with that is because I feel like I used to think, okay, time heals. So it's like you're saying once enough years passed, it doesn't hurt anymore, or it's not sad anymore, it's not as big of a deal.
Yeah.
And I think that's just not the case. I think I try to look at healing as like, no, it's just I'm now able to control
Mm.
myself a little more when that
Mm.
situation feels very heavy.
Yeah.
Where if
I
I'm
think that's well said. I love that concept. Like
thank you.
time
I pursue a path in psychology. So
you should. No, but I think there are phrases and quips that people offer because they wanna be helpful,
Mhm,
but it's not always helpful,
mhm,
and I just like repurposing that entire concept. Like, yes, time is gonna pass, we cannot change that,
mhm,
but that doesn't necessarily mean that you hurt less
mhm.
or you think about someone less or you grieve less, but it transforms,
Yes.
and you may become more skillful
Mhm.
in when you think about it or how you choose to respond to your feelings.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we have, hopefully kept everyone's attention for I know this is a longer episode, but, for those of you that have lost someone to suicide, I hope you found something in this maybe helpful
Yeah.
for your process of grieving, and if you are somebody who's trying to support somebody through suicide, I hope this gives you some perspective,
Mm.
and if you are someone who's suicidal, I hope and pray that you are open to telling somebody and to texting the crisis hotline that you're willing to tell anyone,
Mhm.
that can that can help you because again, like Liz said, it is a symptom of a treatable medical illness, and
Mhm.
there you don't have to feel that way.
Mm-mm.
There's Please reach out to one of us. Reach out to House of Falls community, Instagram, YouTube, Facebook. We have a community. Um, but whether or not you're a part of that, just reach out to somebody and we will try to gear you
Yeah,
toward,
field resources.
yes, get you the resources you need. So, all right. Thank you guys for listening and we'll see you next time.